J.R.R. Tolkien, A Biography, by Humphrey Carpenter. Introduction. Imagine a young man, just turned 21. For 3 long years, he has been forbidden from speaking to, or even writing to, the woman he loves. It was a promise forced upon him by his guardian, a priest who believed the romance was a distraction from the boy's future. For 3 years, he has kept that promise, holding on to nothing but a memory and a hope. Now, on the very minute of his 21st birthday, as the clock strikes midnight, he sits up in bed. His guardianship is officially over. He is his own man. The first thing he does, in that first moment of freedom, is write a letter. He pours his heart onto the page, renewing his declaration of love and asking her to marry him. He sends the letter and waits, his entire future hanging in the balance. When the reply finally comes, his world shatters. The letter says that she is engaged to be married to another man. What would you do? Most of us would probably accept the heartbreak, try to move on. But this young man was not most people. He immediately got on a train, traveled to her town, and met her on the station platform. They walked into the countryside, and by the end of that day, she had broken off her engagement and promised to marry him. That young man was John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And the love story of him and his beloved Edith is not just a footnote in his life, it is the heart of the entire world he would one day create. It is the real-life story of Berain and Luthien, the mortal man and the immortal elf maiden, a tale of impossible love that sits at the very center of his mythology. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary life of J.R.R. Tolkien, as told in the definitive biography by Humphrey Carpenter. This isn't just a story about a brilliant Oxford professor who wrote a few beloved books. It is a journey into the mind of a creator, a man who experienced profound loss, who fought in the trenches of the most brutal war in history, who found fellowship in a small circle of friends, and who, from the quiet of his suburban English home, built a world so complete, so rich with history, language, and sorrow, that it has become a home for millions. By the end of our time together, you will understand where Middle-earth truly came from. It wasn't just imagination. It was forged in the fires of personal tragedy, shaped by an unshakable faith, and built upon the foundation of a love that refused to be broken. This is the story of the man who gave us hobbits, elves, and the hope that even in the darkest of times, a little courage can change the course of the future. Book summary. Our story begins not in the rolling green hills of the Shire, but under the hot, unforgiving sun of South Africa. In 1892, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born in Bloemfontein, a dusty frontier town that felt a world away from the foggy, industrial England his parents had left behind. His father, Arthur, was a bank manager, a man full of ambition, trying to build a future in a new and often harsh land. Young Ronald's earliest memories were not of green grass, but of dust, of a relentless sun, and of a strange, creeping danger. When he was just a toddler, beginning to walk, he stumbled upon a tarantula in the garden. It bit him, and he ran screaming in terror until his nurse rushed to suck the poison out. He would later say the incident left him with no special fear of spiders, but it's hard not to see the shadow of that moment lurking in the monstrous spiders that would one day haunt the dark corners of Mirkwood. It was a brief, almost forgotten chapter of his life, but it was a world of stark contrasts, of intense light and deep shadow, a place where danger could appear suddenly from the dry grass. But this African chapter was tragically short. The climate was taking a toll on young Ronald's health, and his mother, Mabel, longed for the familiar comforts of England. In 1895, she took Ronald and his younger brother Hilary and set sail for home, leaving Arthur behind to wrap up his affairs and join them later. It was a temporary separation, or so they thought. The last clear memory Ronald would ever have of his father was watching him paint his initials, A.R. Tolkien, on the side of a travel trunk. Arthur never made it to England. He contracted rheumatic fever, and in February 1896, he died, thousands of miles away from his wife and young sons. Suddenly, Mabel Tolkien was a widow with 2 small boys and an income of barely 30 shillings a week. The family was adrift. They moved from the city of Birmingham to a small cottage in the nearby hamlet of Sarhall. And for Ronald, this move was everything. It was like stepping out of a black and white world and into one of breathtaking color. Sarhall was, for all intents and purposes, the Shire. It was an idyllic corner of the English countryside, a place of meadows, a winding river, and an old watermill that ground bones for fertilizer. This mill fascinated and terrified the Tolkien brothers. The miller's son, covered in white dust, became the White Ogre in their private mythology. A local farmer who chased them for picking mushrooms was the Black Ogre. This wasn't just a place to live, it was a world alive with stories, with delicious terrors and endless opportunities for adventure. It was here, in these formative years, that Tolkien's deep, almost spiritual love for trees began. He would climb them, lean against them, and even talk to them. He remembered one day seeing a beautiful willow tree by the mill pool get cut down for no reason at all. The log just lay there. "I never forgot that," he said years later. That sense of senseless destruction, of the beauty of the natural world being violated, would become one of the most powerful themes in his life's work. During these years, his mother Mabel was his first and most important teacher. She taught him Latin, French, and German, and he took to languages with an astonishing aptitude. He wasn't just interested in what words meant, he was fascinated by their shapes and sounds. It was as if words themselves were a form of music to him. He was a natural philologist, a lover of words, from the very beginning. His mother also gave him storybooks. He loved tales of Red Indians and George MacDonald's goblin stories. But the one that truly captured his imagination was in Andrew Lang's Red Fairy book, the story of Sigurd, who slew the dragon Fafnir. "I desired dragons with a profound desire," he later wrote. He even tried to write his own story about a dragon when he was about 7. He remembered his mother gently correcting his grammar. He had written a green great dragon, and she told him it should be a great green dragon. He wondered why, and he kept wondering his whole life. It was a small moment, but it shows where his mind was already going, not just to the story, but to the very structure of the language used to tell it. Sarhall was a paradise, a safe and happy world. But it was a paradise that would soon be lost. When Ronald was 8, his mother Mabel did something that would change their lives forever. She decided to convert to Roman Catholicism. In the Protestant England of that time, this was a shocking act, and her family reacted with fury. Her father, a proud Unitarian, was outraged. Other relatives, many of them staunch Baptists, cut her off completely. Financial support, which was already scarce, dried up almost overnight. Mabel was left to raise her 2 sons in poverty, isolated and ostracized for her faith. The strain took a terrible toll on her health. But she never wavered. For Ronald, his mother's faith became inextricably linked with her love and her sacrifice. He later wrote, "My own dear mother was a martyr indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts as he did to Hilary and myself, giving us a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith." The family was forced to move back into the grime and smoke of Birmingham so Ronald could attend King Edward's School. The beautiful countryside of Sarhall was gone, replaced by the clang of trams and the soot of factory chimneys. For Ronald, the loss was profound. It was the first of many goodbyes to a world he loved. Then, the final tragedy struck. In 1904, when Ronald was just 12, Mabel's health collapsed. She was diagnosed with diabetes, which in the days before insulin treatment was a death sentence. She died in November of that year, at the age of just 34. The loss was absolute. It defined him. In one stroke, he lost not only his mother but his entire world. The death, he believed, was a direct result of the persecution she had suffered for her faith. His religion was now all he had left of her, a legacy sealed in martyrdom. This loss made him into two people. On the surface, he was cheerful and loved company. But underneath, there was a deep and abiding pessimism, a profound sense of impending loss that would shadow him for the rest of his life. Nothing was safe. Nothing would last. No victory was ever final. It is the great theme of The Lord of the Rings, the long defeat. Now orphans, Ronald and his brother Hilary were placed under the guardianship of a priest from the Birmingham Oratory, Father Francis Xavier Morgan. Father Francis was a kind, generous, and loving man, half Welsh and half Spanish, with a booming voice and a big heart. He became the closest thing to a father the boys would ever know, providing for them financially from his own pocket and ensuring they had everything they needed. The oratory became their true home. But even Father Francis's kindness could not fill the void Mabel had left. Tolkien poured himself into his studies and his friendships. At King Edward's School, he found an intellectual home. He excelled at languages, not just the required Latin and Greek, but he began to explore on his own. He discovered Anglo-Saxon, or Old English, the language of Beowulf, and felt an immediate connection to it. He read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and realized its dialect was the language of his mother's ancestors in the West Midlands. It felt like coming home. He taught himself the basics of Old Norse so he could read the myths of Sigurd and Fafnir in their original tongue. But he wasn't content just to learn languages. He began to invent them. It started as a game with his cousins, a language called Animalic, where dog nightingale woodpecker 40 met "you are an ass." Soon, this evolved into something more serious. He felt a deep creative urge, and for him, that urge took a linguistic form. He began to craft his own private languages, complete with their own grammar and sound systems, influenced by the languages he loved most, like Spanish and the ancient Gothic he discovered in a dusty primer. This wasn't just a hobby. It was the beginning of his life's work. As he would realize later, a language needs a people to speak it, and a people need a history. The languages came first. The world of Middle-earth would grow around them. In 1908, when Ronald was 16, Father Francis moved the boys to New Lodgings, a boarding house run by a Mrs. Faulkner. It was there he met the other lodger, a pretty gray-eyed girl of 19 with dark hair, who spent most of her time at her sewing machine. Her name was Edith Bratt. Like him, she was an orphan. She was talented, a gifted pianist who dreamed of a career in music, but she was adrift, with no family and an uncertain future. They were two lonely people who found in each other a kindred spirit. A friendship quickly blossomed into a secret romance. They would meet at tea shops and throw sugar lumps into the hats of people passing below. They invented a private whistle call, and would talk for hours from their bedroom windows. By the summer of 1909, they were deeply in love. Tolkien was supposed to be studying for a scholarship to Oxford, but he was distracted by love, and his grades suffered. He failed his first attempt at the scholarship exam. Then, their secret was discovered. Father Francis was deeply shaken. He saw the romance as a foolish distraction that was jeopardizing Ronald's entire future. He was also concerned that Edith was a Protestant. He laid down an ultimatum. Ronald was forbidden from meeting or even corresponding with Edith until he turned 21. For 3 years, they were not to have any contact whatsoever. It was a devastating blow. To a modern ear, it sounds cruel and extreme, but at the time, a guardian's word was law, and Ronald felt an immense debt of loyalty and love to Father Francis. With a heavy heart, he agreed. After a few secret, heartbreaking goodbyes, Edith moved away to Cheltenham. The waiting began. As Tolkien later wrote, probably nothing else would have hardened the will enough to give such an affair permanence. By forcing them apart, Father Francis had accidentally transformed a teenage romance into an epic saga of thwarted love. With Edith gone, Tolkien threw himself into the all-male world of his school. It was during this time that he and a few close friends formed an unofficial secret society. They were the librarians of the school, and they started by secretly making tea in a little cubbyhole in the library. They called themselves the TCBS, which stood for the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, after Barrow's stores where they would continue their meetings. There were 4 core members: Tolkien, the linguist and lover of myth; Christopher Wiseman, a brilliant musician and mathematician; Robert Gilson, an artist and son of the headmaster; and Geoffrey Bache Smith, a thoughtful and talented poet. This wasn't just a casual group of friends. They shared a powerful, youthful idealism. They believed they were destined for greatness, that together they had a mission to bring a new light of beauty and truth into a darkening world. For Tolkien, the TCBS was his first true fellowship, a brotherhood of minds and spirits that profoundly shaped him. It was G.B. Smith who encouraged him to take his own poetry seriously, and it was in the company of these friends that Tolkien first found the confidence to give voice to the myths stirring within him. In December 1910, Tolkien finally won his scholarship to Exeter College, Oxford. He had secured his future. But he still had to endure the long, silent years of waiting for Edith. Finally, the day came. On January 3, 1913, his 21st birthday, he wrote to her, only to receive the crushing news that she was engaged to another man. She had given up hope that he still cared. But Tolkien refused to accept defeat. He raced to Cheltenham, pleaded his case, and won her back. Their love had survived its first great trial. Life at Oxford was a joy. After the grime of Birmingham, the city's ancient beauty was a revelation. He joined clubs, played rugby, and made friends, including a young C.S. Lewis, though their deep friendship would not begin for another decade. He also changed his course of study from classics to English language and literature, allowing him to dive deep into the Anglo-Saxon and Norse texts he loved. It was during this time he discovered the Finnish epic, the Kalevala. He found a grammar book and began to teach himself the language. He said it was like discovering a wine cellar filled with bottles of amazing wine of a kind and flavor never tasted before. It quite intoxicated me. The Finnish language became a major influence on Quenya, the High Elven tongue he was creating. In January 1914, Edith was received into the Catholic Church, a difficult step that caused a painful break with the family she was living with, and she and Ronald were formally betrothed. The future seemed bright. But a shadow was gathering over Europe. When the Great War broke out in the summer of 1914, Tolkien, like so many of his generation, enlisted. But he first finished his degree, achieving a first-class honors, a mark of true academic brilliance. In March 1916, knowing he would soon be sent to the front, he and Edith were married. A few short months later, he was on a ship to France, a second lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers, heading for the Battle of the Somme. The reality of trench warfare was an unimaginable nightmare. He later spoke of the animal horror of it all. The endless mud, the mutilated bodies, the constant terror of shellfire. It was a world of absolute desolation, where the trees were stripped bare and stood like blackened skeletons against the sky. Yet, even in this hellscape, he found a deep and abiding respect for the common English soldier, the ordinary men from Lancashire who faced the horror with a quiet, indomitable courage. His character Sam Gamgee, he said, was a reflection of these men, the batmen and privates who he recognized as so far superior to myself. Then came the news that shattered his world for a second time. On July 1, 1916, the first day of the Somme offensive, his dear friend from the TCBS, Rob Gilson, was killed leading his men into action. Tolkien was devastated. "I do not feel a member of a complete body now," he wrote to G.B. Smith. "I honestly feel that the TCBS has ended." A few months later, Tolkien himself was struck down, not by a bullet, but by trench fever, a debilitating illness carried by lice. He was shipped back to a hospital in England, his life spared by a tiny insect. While he was recovering, he received another letter. His last surviving friend from the corps of the TCBS, G.B. Smith, had been wounded by a shell and had died of his injuries. The fellowship was broken. But before he died, Smith had written Tolkien a final, haunting letter. "My chief consolation is that if I am scuppered tonight," he wrote, "there will still be left a member of the great TCBS to voice what I dreamed and what we all agreed upon. May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say long after I am not there to say them." It was a sacred charge. The war had taken almost everything, but it had given Tolkien a mission. He had seen the heights of fellowship and the depths of horror. He had seen the courage of small, ordinary men. And he had been handed a torch by a dying friend. While still convalescing in 1917, he took a cheap notebook, and on the cover, he wrote, "The Book of Lost Tales." He began to write the story of the fall of the hidden elven city of Gondolin. It was the beginning of the Silmarillion, the great mythology that would occupy him for the rest of his life. He was no longer just inventing languages, he was building a world for them, a world of gods and elves, of great beauty and profound sorrow. He was saying the things his friends were no longer there to say. One day during this period, he and Edith were walking in a wood near Roos in Yorkshire. The ground was carpeted with hemlock flowers. There, in that quiet glade, Edith, with her raven hair and bright eyes, danced and sang for him. In that moment, she became for him Luthien Tenuvial, the immortal elven maiden dancing in the woods of Doriath. And he was Berain, the mortal man who fell in love with her from afar. This vision, born from a moment of pure love and beauty in a world torn by war, became the central story of his entire legendarium. It was their story, written into the fabric of his mythology. Years later, after Edith's death, he would write to his son, "She was and knew she was my Luthien." After the war, life became a quiet rhythm of family and academia. He got a job working on the New English Dictionary in Oxford, then became a reader and later a professor at the University of Leeds, before finally returning to Oxford in 1925 as the professor of Anglo-Saxon. He and Edith raised 4 children, John, Michael, Christopher, and Priscilla. He was a devoted and loving father, who invented bedtime stories for his children when they couldn't sleep and wrote them elaborate, illustrated letters from Father Christmas every year. His academic life was demanding. He was a brilliant and beloved teacher. Students remembered how he would stride into a lecture on Beowulf, fix them with his gaze, and begin to declaim the opening lines in a booming, resonant Old English, turning the lecture hall into an ancient mead hall. He poured immense energy into his teaching and into reforming the Oxford English syllabus. It was in this period that his friendship with C.S. Lewis deepened. They had met before, but now they found they were kindred spirits, united by a love of what they called northernness, the myths and sagas of ancient Scandinavia. They formed a new fellowship, a circle of friends called the Inklings, who would meet on Thursday nights in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College to drink, smoke, and read aloud from their works in progress. Lewis became Tolkien's most important reader and his greatest encourager. The unpayable debt that I owe to him, Tolkien later said, was not influence, but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. It was during a long, late-night conversation with Tolkien and another inkling, Hugo Dyson, that Lewis finally overcame his last intellectual hurdles to Christianity. Tolkien explained his belief that myths are not lies, but are reflections of a splintered fragment of the true light. The story of Christ, he argued, was the one true myth, a myth that had actually happened. It was a conversation that changed Lewis's life, and he converted to Christianity shortly after. Amidst all this, teaching, family life, and his secret, sprawling work on the Silmarillion, something unexpected happened. One summer day, while grading a stack of dull examination papers, he came to a page a student had mercifully left blank. On that blank page, for reasons he could never explain, he scribbled a single sentence: "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." He didn't know what a hobbit was, but the name generated a story in his mind. The tale began as another amusement for his children, a light-hearted adventure story about a comfortable, respectable hobbit named Bilbo Baggins who gets swept off on an adventure with a wizard and a company of dwarves. But as he wrote, elements from his grander mythology began to creep in. The wizard Gandalf, the dwarves, the elves of Rivendell, the necromancer, it was all connected. Mr. Baggins had strayed into the world of the Silmarillion, into the Third Age of Middle-earth. Tolkien wrote most of the book and read it to his children, but he never finished it. The typescript lay in his study for years, incomplete. It might have stayed there forever, but for a fortunate chain of events. A former student of his, Elaine Griffiths, mentioned the story to a friend who worked for the publisher George Allen and Unwin. The publisher asked to see it, loved it, but pointed out that it wasn't finished. Could Professor Tolkien please complete it? So, he did. He sat down and finally wrote the concluding chapters. The Hobbit was published on September 21, 1937, and was an immediate success. C.S. Lewis wrote a glowing review, announcing that a new star has appeared. The public loved it, and soon, his publisher was asking for a sequel. A large public, Stanley Unwin wrote, will be clamoring next year to hear more from you about hobbits. Tolkien was hesitant. His heart was with the Silmarillion, the great, tragic work that he considered his true life's calling. He tried to offer it for publication, but it was seen as too dense, too strange, too Celtic. No, the publisher wanted more hobbits. Reluctantly, Tolkien agreed to try. In December 1937, he wrote to his publisher, "I have written the first chapter of a new story about hobbits, a long-expected party." The new book, which he would eventually call The Lord of the Rings, was not an easy journey. It took him 12 long years to write. The story, he said, got out of hand. It grew darker, more serious, and grander in scope. The simple magic ring from The Hobbit became the One Ring, the instrument of the Dark Lord Sauron, and the story became an epic struggle between hope and despair. He worked mostly at night, writing with his dip pen on the back of old exam papers, meticulously crafting the history, geography, and chronology of his world. He was plagued by self-doubt and what he called the long defeat. There were long periods where he was dead stuck and wrote nothing at all. But with the steady encouragement of C.S. Lewis and the Inklings, to whom he read the book chapter by chapter, he persevered. Finally, in the autumn of 1949, it was finished. Even then, publication was not straightforward. It was too long, too strange. He had a frustrating 2-year negotiation with another publisher who wanted to publish it alongside the Silmarillion but ultimately got cold feet. Finally, in 1952, he went back to his original publisher, Allen and Unwin. Rayner Unwin, the boy who had first approved The Hobbit for a shilling, was now a young director at the firm. He championed the book, convincing his father to take what they both knew was a big risk. The Lord of the Rings was published in 3 volumes between 1954 and 1955. The initial reaction was mixed. Some critics found it childish and absurd, others hailed it as a masterpiece. But slowly, it found its audience. Sales grew steadily, translations began to appear, and Tolkien started to receive fan mail from all over the world. Then, in the mid-1960s, something extraordinary happened. An unauthorized paperback edition was released in America, creating a literary controversy that catapulted the book into the public consciousness. Suddenly, The Lord of the Rings became a cultural phenomenon, especially on college campuses. Frodo lives and Gandalf for President Buttons appeared. Tolkien became, to his great dismay, a cult figure. The quiet, intensely private professor was baffled by the fame. He was troubled by the flood of letters, the intrusive phone calls, and the pilgrims who showed up on his doorstep. He retired from his professorship in 1959, hoping to finally complete the Silmarillion. But the task was immense. Decades of revisions had created a tangled web of manuscripts, and he struggled to find a final, definitive form for the work. His later years were quiet. Edith's health was failing, and in 1968, they moved from Oxford to the seaside town of Bournemouth, where she could live a more comfortable and sociable life among friends. It was a great sacrifice for him, cutting him off from the academic life and friends he loved, but he did it for her. Edith died in November 1971, at the age of 82. They had been married for 55 years. Tolkien was heartbroken. He returned to Oxford, where Merton College gave him honorary rooms. He lived out his last 2 years there, surrounded by his books, visiting his children and grandchildren, a lonely but not unhappy man. He died peacefully on September 2, 1973, at the age of 81. He and Edith are buried together in a cemetery in a quiet suburb of Oxford. The gray granite headstone bears their names, and 2 others, Berain and Luthien. The love story that began in a boarding house and was immortalized in a mythical forest had found its final, quiet resting place. His great life's work, the Silmarillion, was left unfinished, but his son Christopher would painstakingly piece together the vast collection of manuscripts, finally publishing it in 1977, allowing the world to see the full, magnificent scope of the mythology that his father had built over a lifetime. Commentary. When you look at the life of J.R.R. Tolkien, what strikes you most is the profound connection between the man and the world he created. Middle-earth was not an escape from his life, it was the expression of it. Think about the central themes of his work. The deep, abiding love for the simple, peaceful countryside, that's Sarhal, the lost paradise of his childhood. The ever-present sense of loss, the sorrow for a world that is fading, the long defeat, that is the echo of a boy who lost both his parents before he was a teenager. The unshakable courage of the small and the humble, the hobbits who stand up against an overwhelming darkness, that's the reflection of the ordinary English soldiers he saw in the trenches of the Somme. And the power of fellowship, the bond between friends who walk together into danger, that is the spirit of the TCBS. And the Inklings. Tolkien's work teaches us that our greatest creations often come from our deepest experiences. He didn't just write a story, he poured his life, his loves, his losses, his faith, and his friendships, into building a world. He believed in the power of myth, not as a collection of lies, but as a way of glimpsing a deeper truth. He called it subcreation, the act of making a secondary world that feels as real and true as our own. And he believed this was one of the highest functions a person could perform. So, what can we take from his life, today? I think there are 2 powerful lessons. First, is the idea of your own great work. Tolkien spent over 50 years building his mythology. It was his private passion, something he did not for fame or money, but because he felt compelled to do it. For most of his life, his only audience was his children and a few close friends. It brings up a question for all of us: what is the work that you are called to do? What is the story, the project, the idea that lives inside you, that you would work on even if no one else ever saw it? Tolkien's life is a testament to the power of dedicating yourself to a single, profound passion. The second lesson is found in his little story, Leaf by Nigel. It's about a painter who spends his entire life working on one enormous painting of a tree. He gets lost in the details, spending ages on a single leaf, and he's constantly interrupted by the practical demands of life. He dies with the great work unfinished. But in the afterlife, he finds his tree, finished and real, a true part of creation. It's a gift. This story was Tolkien's own fear and his own hope. He feared he would never finish his work, that he would be judged as a scholar who had squandered his time on a private hobby, but he hoped that what he was creating was more than just a story, that it was, in some small way, a glimpse of a deeper reality. Perhaps the greatest lesson from Tolkien's life is this: pay attention to the leaves. The small details, the things you love for their own sake, a word, a tree, a friendship, a story told in a quiet room. Because it's from those small, carefully tended leaves that the great trees of our lives grow. And in the end, that is the greatest gift we have to offer the world. That was the story of J.R.R. Tolkien, based on the biography by Humphrey Carpenter. We've journeyed through the key moments of his life today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. The map can show you the rivers and the mountains, but it can never let you feel the wind on your face or hear the sound of the water. The real magic happens when you explore the territory for yourself. This book is an incredible guide to the man behind the myths. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts, it's about understanding the heart of a creator, and it might just inspire you to find the creator within yourself. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that these stories matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.